Okay. So, what we're going to discuss today is basically different ways that you can use herbs to help your patients and yourself. And so, you can do this orally, you can do it topically, you can do oil extractions, you can do water extractions, things like that. But we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the nomenclature involved with herbal formulations as well. So to start off, we're going to talk about some abbreviations for different herbal parts, prescribing notations, different types of extracts, the internal and external use. There's a bunch of goals there as well we'll talk about. So to start off, there'll be like an exam question on this, the abbreviation of the different parts of the plant. So you don't need to know the examples like blueberries and cranberries, but basically what we have is the abbreviation in the left-hand column. And this is the abbreviation of the Latin word. So bacche is meaning basically berries. So I put in brackets what the English word is. To the left of that is what the Latin term is, and then the abbreviation. So in some herbal textbooks, you might see something like cinnamon core or cinnamon cortex. And that's what it basically says is the plant that's being used and the part of the plant. Because in some cases, you don't necessarily get the same therapeutic effects if you're using the flower versus the bark or versus the roots. And so the type of phytochemicals that you're looking for might be found in higher amounts in certain parts of the plant than other parts. So you can go through, I've given some examples just for interest's sake on the right-hand side. But what I might say on the exam would be something along the lines of ginseng radix refers to what part of the plant? Does it refer to the root, the rhizome, seeds, cones, etc.? So to go through some examples of this. So here we've got berries. So the vaccinium would be cranberries. Here we have bulbs. So this would be the garlic or onions that you would have used the bulb for. The radix is the roots from, for example, ginseng or Codenopsis, and you boil these up. Now rhizomes, which are shown on the left from turmeric. So turmeric, the plant used in curry, technically speaking, it's not a root, it's a rhizome. And what the difference is if you look at these little finger projections coming off the main root here, each of these can be broken off and a new plant can grow from it. And this is different than a standard root like ginseng, where if you break it in half, only one part will grow. So this allows you to propagate it through breaking up the roots. So that's what a rhizome is. Other plants that have rhizomes are things like ginger, galanga, are the two other ones that jump to mind. In the middle of the screen here is humulus, so that's hops, so that's what's used to make beer, but it's also used in herbal medicine as a sleep aid, as a nervine, it's calming, and you're actually using the cones of the hops plant, and so cones are basically strobilus, so that's the only one that I know that falls into that category. On the right-hand side, here you've got cayenne, and this is the fruit. So fructus or fruct is the abbreviation for the fruit of the plant. And so you wouldn't use the leaves, you wouldn't use the roots from cayenne, but you would use the fruit. And here we have chamomile flowers. So Florus matricaria refers to the chamomile flowers. Folia mentha would refer to the actual leaves of like peppermint leaves, which is the main component of when you have peppermint tea. But they can use the entire herb, which would just be herba mentha, would be the whole entire herb. On the right we have a lichen from Usnea. That's old man's beard. It grows on the west coast, up in the mountains, and so it's a lichen. We don't use a lot of other lichens. That's the main one that we use. So those are just some examples. You don't need to know those examples per se. I would just give you, let's say, Folia mentha, and say it refers to what part of the plant. It would be, is it A, the flowers, the leaf, the rhizome, etc. Somebody asked me what's going on next week because of Thanksgiving. We have no class next week, so it's a holiday. So when it comes to herbal medicine, it's important to ensure that you use the right amount of the plant. And there are therapeutic ranges that we can use. So it may be, for example, with licorice, you may use 1 teaspoon 3 times a day of the tincture. Well, that's actually pretty too high for licorice, but you might use drop dosages, you might use grams, you might use, those are the main measurements that I can think of. So to give you an example, when it comes to herbal medicine, it's not a precise science. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about using a teaspoon is pretty standard. Most people know what that is. But the reality is, if you measure out a teaspoon, there is variations between what typically is a teaspoon. So a teaspoon could refer to 4 or 5 mils. So that's roughly what it is. So already we're looking at a 20% difference depending on what teaspoon you grab. And so usually 5 mils is what I think of a teaspoon, but some teaspoons are smaller. We often recommend someone take 1 teaspoon 3 times a day of a particular formula. That's pretty standard. You might also go with a tablespoon, which is basically 3 teaspoons. So that's 15 mils. So those are the 2 main ways that you might recommend someone take a tincture. I mean, a tablespoon's a pretty high dose. Teaspoons are pretty standard, but it's worth, I want you to remember that 1 teaspoon equals 4 to 5 mils and 1 tablespoon equals 15 mils. Now, when it comes to drops, some old herb books talk about drop dosages where they'll recommend, let's say, 15 drops or 30 drops before meals of a particular herb, and that's what they use in the old textbooks for the dosage. The issue that I have with that is drops vary quite a bit on how much volume they have. And so when you look at water, water forms hydrogen bonds with each other, different water molecules. And so that's what makes water stick together. And so 1 drop of water is basically, 1 mil contains about 15 drops. I actually measured this out because I was curious to know. So 15 drops is basically a mil. So if you were to say, take 15 drops of a tea, that would be basically saying 1 mil of the tea. The problem is a lot of time when we use herbal extracts, we're using alcohol-based ones. And the alcohol, it disrupts the surface tension of the water drop. So you get smaller water drops because there's not, the concentration of water is less. And so just as an experiment, when I started measuring how many drops you'd have in a standard tincture, and a lot of tinctures, which are herbal extracts using water, they typically contain 40% water. And measuring it out, depending on the tincture I use, I might get anywhere between 28 to 38 drops per mil. So roughly, that's going to be twice as many drops to make up a single mil. So that means if you're using drop dosages of like 80% alcohol extract, you're going to get a lot less therapeutic dose in 15 drops than you would if it was 15 drops of water. So the volume is going to be less when you're using drops with a higher alcohol percentage. That may or may not be a bad thing. I mean, in reality, the alcohol is going to dissolve the active ingredients more, so you could still get a really good therapeutic dose, but that's just something worth noting, that there is a difference. So I prefer to go with recommending mils or teaspoons. But even then, teaspoons is not really that precise. So the point is, when you're looking at a lot of herbs, the therapeutic range is relatively broad. So if you look at the textbooks, it might be the therapeutic dose could be anywhere between 1 to 4 mils 3 times a day. So it's pretty broad. And if you're using teaspoons, plus or minus 20%, that's one thing. And when you're using drop dosages, if you're using a 40% versus a 60% alcohol concentration, it will change the amount that the patient's getting, okay? So it's not a big deal. If these were like really toxic substances and you're off by 20%, you could kill the patient. If you're giving chamomile tea or golden seal or ginseng, it's, it's not the end of the world that you're not, exactly perfectly at 2 mils. Plus or minus 20% I'm okay with. But don't forget also is that from batch to batch, from year to year, there will be some variation as well with the herbs. So some abbreviations that are used for prescribing drugs, but also prescribing herbs. Here's a list of them. Just memorize them for the exam. The Latin term is on the right. The English is sort of beside that in brackets, and then in single form. So to give you an example, take 1 tablespoon by mouth each day before meals is what the first one says. Just as an assignment for yourself, just translate these little things into English. I'll probably give you one of these on exam. 1 teaspoon 3 times a day with food before meals. And so you just kind of look it up and you can see what these different things mean. Without food would be SC, with food would be CC. So that gives just you an idea. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those guys, but you can just look at that. I'll give you one question on the exam on those guys. Now, when it comes to gathering and storing herbs, just one second. I'm going to get my questions. For some reason, they're not. Let me get these out of here. There, that's better. Now I can see them all. I have a question. Do each of those drops contain the same amount of herbal extract? Is it that the drop is a different size due to other molecule sizes rather than the actual active ingredients being a different amount? The drops that I showed you before, there's going to be a few different factors that are going to affect it. When you start dissolving substances in it, that'll disrupt the hydrogen bonds as well. When you start adding alcohol in it, that's going to disrupt the bonds as well. So if you were to take a tincture of ginseng, I would imagine the drops are going to be different in size than a tincture of chamomile. And so it might be one has 30 drops, the other one has 25 drops, even though they're both, let's say, 40% alcohol. And then if you take a tincture of ginseng, that's 40% alcohol, it will be different than if you have a tincture with 80% alcohol. Now, most tinctures are basically 40 or 50% usually, but just appreciate there's some variation there. So I don't know if I made that, if that makes sense. Someone's asking, what happens when a patient goes and picks out products on their own regarding the differences in therapeutic dose from product to product? Well, the challenge is if a herbal product, if you buy a tincture made from chamomile or golden seal and it's 40% alcohol and it's a tincture that's a 1 to 5 dilution, we'll talk about that later on, it should be fairly consistent. But it's also possible that if somebody goes and buys a product that's maybe only 20% alcohol and it's a 1 to 10 dilution, the concentration will be different. So there are some standard ways of labeling the extracts that you're using. We'll get to that later on when we talk about the tinctures. But patients may not necessarily know the difference between them. So most of you in practice aren't going to be getting into the herbal farming business. However, you might go out and gather a few things here and there. And certainly I've done this in the past. I don't have a lot of time now to do this, so I'm kind of at the stage where it's more cost effective for me to buy the pre-made things than make it from scratch. But it's not particularly very difficult to gather and grow your own herbs if you've got the time and the property and everything else. But obviously there's certain herbs that will be very easy to grow, like dandelion. I don't think you'll have any problems growing that. But I think it would be impossible for you to grow something like myrrh, a resin that grows on trees in the Middle East, just because the climate won't support it here. Now, when you look at, there's a difference between, there's 2 ways you can get your herbs. You can get cultivated plants. So that basically means it's grown on a farm. And in general, this is probably a good idea because you basically are taking plants in a sustainable fashion. So some farmer is growing a field of ginseng, and then after 4 or 5 years, they harvest it, and then they replant the ginseng every few years or whatever. And It's a nice cycle. Now, you can also wildcraft, which basically means you're gathering it from the wild. So you walk in the forest or in a field, you find a particular plant and you use it. Now, I would say now, did you guys, something just happened here. You guys still with me? Somebody give me an answer here. Yes. Was it a slow connection? They said it was a slow connection. Actually, I'm asking too many questions at the same time. Audio is cutting out. Okay, I don't know why that is. I'm going to I just turned me off so you don't see me, and that should make it better. Okay. So when it comes to wildcrafted herbs, there are certain things that I really don't think there's any issues getting from the wild. So if you want to gather elderberry flowers or the berries themselves, or if you want to get mullein, or comfrey, or dandelions, or burdock, these are all very common plants that they're basically weeds that grow pretty much everywhere in Ontario. And a lot of herbs you'll find that have medicinal effects, or a lot of plants that have medicinal effects, are very common and easy to find because there has to be enough of a community of these plants around and widespread for them to be kind of useful and documented in the herbal textbooks. There are exceptions to this, though, and there are certain things like ginseng, which was once you could pretty much find it in most hardwood forests in Canada. But what happened is when the early settlers came along, they realized that ginseng was highly valued in China and Asia. And so Canadian ginseng, which is different than the Asian varieties, they started harvesting these and gathering it from the wild. So a lot of the trappers would gather it when they're out collecting their furs. And as a result, they pretty much made most ginseng areas where it was cultivated or where it was gathered from, it's kind of gone, basically become endangered or is no longer available in those areas. And the reason for this is when it comes to ginseng takes about 4 or 5 years to mature. Unlike dandelions, where it basically sows 1 million seeds every year, it's impossible to over harvest dandelion roots. And if you did, people would probably be pretty happy because they wouldn't have to deal with them in the yards anymore. But when it comes to ginseng, one plant takes anywhere between 4 and 20 years to mature. So once you remove it from the ground, it's not going to grow back unless you leave the seeds there, and it may take a while. So you want to avoid gathering things like ginseng in the wild. And there are parts in Ontario where it does grow. I've spent at least 25 years stumbling around forests and various areas looking at herbs, and I've never seen ginseng once in the wild. It used to be up around the Muskoka areas. My grandfather told me an area where he knew it used to grow back when he was a kid. The trappers were gathering it up there, and it was a perfect environment for it, and there wasn't a single plant. I went and spent a day looking for it. So with regards to wildcrafted, some of the things that you want to do is, if you are gathering from the wild and you're concerned that it could become endangered, then maybe don't over harvest from the same area every single year. Maybe mix it up a little bit just to be nice, Also, it's important to know when is the right time to harvest, because sometimes you want to harvest in early morning, or you want to harvest in the afternoon. Maybe you want to harvest in the fall, or maybe in the spring, or maybe it's every 2 years, depending on the type of plant that you're harvesting. There's the young plant, but not the mature plant. So lots of different things, and it's all dependent on the herb. So if you're interested in this, then you got to get a book, learn about the plants, and get all the details on it. One thing is, when consuming herbs, you could potentially use either fresh or dry herbs. They both, in theory, should be fine, but there are some exceptions. Sometimes the drying process is required to to convert certain chemicals to make them more active. But for the most part, you could use fresh herbs, dry herbs. I'm not sure if there's any therapeutic benefit of using a fresh herb over a dry herb. If you're making a salad, fresh basil tastes a lot better than dry basil. From a therapeutic standpoint, fresh, chamomile isn't necessarily any better than dried chamomile. So most of the herbal textbooks that you look at, the dosages and everything is using dry herbs, generally speaking. So you can use fresh herbs, but the difference here is that when you gather them fresh, there's going to be a lot of water in there. And so if you look at the leaves of a particular plant, so if you're gathering, let's say, peppermint, and you're making a fresh tea with it, which is, I've done that before for sure, the leaves contain about 90% water, give or take. And so what that means is if you normally need a little bit, like a teaspoon of the dried peppermint leaves to make the tea, if it's fresh, you may need 5 times as much or 10 times as much to get the same sort of taste or therapeutic effects, because some of those active ingredients, just because the water is affecting the weight of it. When you're looking at roots, roots are usually about 50% water. So fresh dandelion roots for something is going to have at least 50% water. And there's a couple of issues with this, in addition to the fact that you're going to need to use more of the fresh herb than to make the dry herb. It's also going to go and mess up if you're making a tincture, let's say, and you want to make an alcohol extract of a particular herb, and you want to ensure that it's 40% alcohol in there because you want to keep the bacteria count down and have the right amount of alcohol to extract the fat-soluble compounds. If you're using fresh herbs, 1, you may get too low a dose of the herbs. 2, you're going to affect the ratio of water to alcohol in the mixture, which could impact the solvent capacity of the alcohol by reducing it. And it could also potentially decrease the alcohol to a level where it's no longer going to act as a preservative. And so if you're using alcohol as a preservative, you're going to need at least 20%. I don't know what the exact amount is, but things below 20%, funguses and bacteria could potentially grow in there. And I don't know if it's 15 or 18 or what the percentage is, but if it drops too low, then potentially some other little creature could get in there and start fermenting the plant material. So that's one issue that I have with the fresh herbs. The other issue is, like, if you're using, if you're looking at the old textbooks, they will be using dry herbs and tinctures that have been extracted using dry herbs for the most part. So if you're trying to do your conversion of how many mils do I need if it's a fresh herb, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges. You can't really use the old measurements, okay? Now, someone mentioned that, someone's statement or question says, I have heard that wild-crafted herbs are more potent due to fighting through less ideal growing conditions rather than cultivated plants being grown in comfortable environments. Have you heard this before, and do you think there's any truth to that? That's a great question. What we know is, I've looked at a couple studies with organic farming where they're not using pesticides, and it's established that organic food often will make more phytochemicals that have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects and things like that, or antimicrobial effects, because they're basically producing a lot of these phytochemicals to protect themselves against environmental stressors, whether that's drought or whether that's viruses or bacteria or whatever it may be. And so there is research that shows, certainly when you compare ginseng that's grown in certain conditions versus other ones, some ginseng roots will look like a carrot, and other ones are all tiny and gnarly, and the ones cultivated and farmed might be 4 times the size of a herb that's grown in the wild. So certainly in Chinese medicine, the ones that are smaller or more gnarly are worth more money. So I think there is something to be said about some cultivated plants won't be as good as well-crafted ones. And you could also, don't forget, grow, for example, ginseng in its natural environment, like underneath beech trees in a hardwood forest with maples and beech trees. But most of the Canadian ginseng is grown in the old tobacco fields in southern Ontario. So they've converted a lot of tobacco fields to ginseng farms, and you'll see they create an artificial canopy using some type of material that partially blocks out the sun. And so I think the ones that are grown in those tobacco farms, they're not probably going to be quite as concentrated as the ones that are grown in the beech trees or grow in the wild. But that being said, that might cost more, and I don't know if it's how much. Maybe you just have to take twice as much of the herb. So, but yes, definitely. When we're looking at one of the studies with organically grown fruits and vegetables, they tended to have different amounts of certain phytochemicals in there, higher amounts of those phytochemicals. So that's one study that says that maybe organically grown foods are better for you because they have to create their own natural pesticides that are usually these phytochemicals that are good for us. When it comes to drying herbs, one thing is, if you're going to dry, a couple things that you have to be aware of is that you'll want to make sure those herbs dry quickly and thoroughly. Because if you get a whole big plant, you spend the day gathering herbs, and let's say it's raining or wet when you get them, or even if it's just you're digging them up, and you leave them in your garage for a couple of days, they will start growing mold fairly quickly. And so once mold starts growing, it will ruin it, make it taste bad, and it could also be toxic. So you want to grow it quite quickly. So you want to dry it quite quickly. So one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you have an area that you can spread them out so there's no overlapping of the leaves. Cut it into smaller pieces. Have a little bit of dry air circulating around it. Sunlight, a little bit of sunlight is not going to hurt it, but sunlight does destroy phytochemicals. So you want to be careful about the type of herb you're drying and how much sun you want to expose it to, because it could lose its activity. If you're doing a small batch at home, one of the things that you can do, and I've made up in the past, is you make kind of a frame, a box, and you use basically screens from windows. And you buy a bunch of those or get a bunch secondhand, and you insert those horizontally and then lay your herbs on top of that. And then you can have a light fan blowing around it. That's a great way to do it, to basically build a little contraption. The other thing you can do is just get a screen from a window and just prop it up on top of your fridge. And naturally, the fridge generates a little bit of heat. It's usually in a darker area. A lot of people suspend or dry herbs from the ceiling above the fridge as well, because there's just a slight amount of circulation of the air from the fan from the fridge, and it's usually a little bit warm. So, so you could dry them in your garage if it's well ventilated. Sometimes up in the rafters, it's a little bit warmer up there. But you need to have dry air that's circulating around, and less sun is better. I mean, yes, sometimes they'll do sun-dried tomatoes and stuff like that, and it'll be okay, but in general, it can potentially destroy some of the active ingredients. If herbs are not dried properly, molds, not moles. I never saw that until now. Molds, there you go. I'm going to correct that. Now, when it comes to storing herbs, appreciate that you want to make sure that they're not coming in contact with light, moisture, and creatures. So creatures could be anything from rodents, and I can say that I've stored things, herbs that I've had for, let's say, Bot100. I had a whole bunch of samples, and I stored them in the garage or in the basement of an old place. And, surprisingly, mice get in there and they eat these weren't for patients, I want to emphasize that. They'll go in there and eat some really weird stuff. Like they'll eat licorice and do all this, eat some of the mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, and which sort of surprised me. So obviously rodents, you don't want them getting in there. You don't want insects, bacteria, funguses getting in there. They can basically make them toxic, or some of those things carry diseases as well. when you're storing it, you want to make sure that it's kept in a dry environment. So you want to control the humidity. So I wouldn't, keep a whole bunch of loose leaf teas in the basement, for example. It wouldn't be the best place if your basement is damp and has high humidity. So usually most things, when they're sealed, they're in like vacuum sealed containers with little desiccants in there to keep them nice and dry. Even seeds in the clinic, or if you have teas in your clinic and you bag them yourself, you want to make sure that the bags are sealed properly, they're kept in the dark, and that they don't, basically sit around too long. So the big thing is heat, insects, and sunlight. Sunlight is high in energy. So what that means is UV light tends to bleach things. That's why you have to change your roof every 25, 30 years, because the sun just starts destroying even like the tar and the fibers that make up your roofing material. And so with herbs, a lot of the phytochemicals are quite delicate. So UV light can break up these double bonds and basically make them inactive. For example, when beer goes skunky, one of the compounds in beer called hops, one of the herbs in there, when it's exposed to UV light, one of the phytochemicals will break down and create that skunky smell. And so that's why most beer bottles are stored in amber bottles so that they won't go skunky, except for Corona and a few other ones. But so you got to be careful where you store the herbs. The other thing you want to be careful about is how long you keep them for. There's no real set rules for this. I would say leaves and flowers, if they're not properly stored, technically speaking, if they're dry for a long period of time, you can probably keep them for years and years and years if they're sealed with a desiccant and everything else. If you're just going to have when you walk into some herbal stores, you'll see jars of leaves and flowers and roots just sort of on the shelves. And in that case, some guidelines are basically a year for leaves and flowers. So think about the herbs that you buy for cooking. If you have a bag of coriander or cumin or something like that in your cupboard, if it's there for 10 years, it's not going to be as aromatic. Some of those compounds are going to evaporate away and they'll start to taste a little bit stale. So keeping it well sealed, a year should be fine. Even longer, I would imagine, but it depends on how well it's sealed. Roots and barks and seeds, probably a little bit longer, because usually the material, if it's not ground, takes longer for it to break down. Once you turn something into a powder, it's going to be more susceptible to ambient humidity and the air as well. Now, when it comes to tinctures, which is an alcohol extract of herbs, they can last potentially for decades. There are some herbal extracts that don't last very long in tinctures because they don't do well in alcohol. For example, St. John's wort. There are a number of different active ingredients, and St. John's wort is one of the best known antidepressants, herbal antidepressants. Got a lot of good research to support it. But the main active ingredient is something called hyperforin, which is not stable in an aqueous environment. So if you make a tincture with it or a tea from it, it'll be stable for maybe weeks, maybe months, but over time it will start to degrade, so it will lose its potency. So yes, you can make a tea from St. John's wort and drink it right away and it'll be fine, or you can make a tincture and if you use it up within a week or so, it might be fine, but over time it will break down. So St. John's wort, I'd be more inclined to give it in a capsule or a tablet form than giving it as an alcohol extract. So in general, when it comes to tinctures, they don't tend to go bad, meaning molds and bacteria won't break them down because the alcohol content is so high. But the issue with tinctures is there are phytochemicals that over time will break down. There was a Herbalgram article where they basically looked at a number of different herbal extracts from about 100 years ago, and they still had the active ingredients in there. Maybe the potency goes down, but they were still in that. I'm going to put my camera back on, just out of curiosity. If it starts getting shaky again, let me know. So herbal extracts. There's a few different types of herbal extracts we're going to talk about. We'll talk about water extracts, alcohol extracts will be the two main ones that we're going to discuss, and then a couple of oil extracts as well. So to start off, this is a quick little summary. When you make a cup of tea, you're probably going to use a couple grams of herbs and a cup of water, and the little green dots in there represent how many of the active ingredients in there. So when it comes to a cup of tea, it's not very strong, but you drink a lot. You drink a cup, let's say 250 mils of the herbal extract. So basically what that means is you're going to end up getting the same amount of therapeutic phytochemicals in there as you would from maybe taking a small amount, like a quarter teaspoon or whatever it is, of the tincture. So tinctures are usually, or basically tinctures are alcohol extracts, usually a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 dilution. We'll talk about that more in a second. That means 1 part herb to 4 parts basically solvent. Fluid extracts are a little bit more concentrated, and then solid extracts are even more concentrated. We'll discuss these in detail. Now, when it comes to the phytochemicals, what you're trying to do when you do an extract is dissolve the active ingredient that you're looking for. And something that's worth remembering is basic chemistry is the active ingredient, you want to dissolve it in a solvent that has the same properties. And so polarity refers to, like, for example, a polar solvent is water. So that basically means that it has the ability to form little like magnet interactions, like dipoles, like negative and positive charges in there. So if you think about water molecules, they have a positive and a negative end. And so that's what allows them to interact with each other to find the hydrogen bonds. But they'll also form hydrogen bonds and polar interactions with things like oxygen, nitrogens, things like that, tend to make things polar in nature. Non-polar things are basically hydrocarbons. So this is like gasoline, where all you have is carbons and hydrogens. So certain things like carotenoids, which is beta-carotene, or lycopene, found in carrots and tomatoes, the red and the orange color, that's non-polar. So that means you need fat to dissolve that. Other things like fiber, soluble fiber, has lots of oxygens in it relative to the carbons, and that makes it very water soluble. So what makes the active ingredient soluble is, one, the polarity of the solvent and the solute, whether they're interacting. So you want to use the same type of solvent to dissolve that particular solute. So what I mean by that is, if you look at a phytochemical and it contains a ratio of 3 carbons to 3 oxygens, then it's basically a solvent that has that same ratio would be the best one to extract that active ingredient. If you have an active ingredient that has pretty much all carbons and no oxygens, then using a solvent like an oil or a benzene or something like that would be the best solvent for that. The other thing to consider is when you're trying to dissolve things, the higher the temperature, the easier it is to dissolve it. That's why you're able to dissolve certain things in hot water much better than cold water. So if you want to make a cup of tea, use hot water to dissolve it. If you use cold water, you'll get some extraction, but it'll take longer and you just won't have the same concentration. In some cases, using pressure can have an effect. That's more if you're getting certain things like volatile oils. Messing around with the pressure will determine what sort of stays dissolved in the solvent, what will evaporate away. The surface areas also can have an impact as well. If you're trying to make, let's say, an extract of a particular root, if you just put a big chunk of root in there, or a rhizome, like ginger tea, if you just put the entire root in there and pour water on top, it'll take longer. You'll probably have to boil it for a long period of time to be able to make a potent extraction. But if you were to grind up, use like a cheese grater and grate up the root, or if you had the powdered root and you added it to water, it's going to do the extraction much faster and probably do a better job as well. There isn't anything wrong with using roots. It's just you need to use. It requires more time and may not be quite as good. In some cases, acidity can play a role. There are certain compounds called alkaloids. These contain nitrogens, and if you use an acid like vinegar, it'll help to dissolve these alkaloids in water, because it basically, by adding more acid, you add protons to the nitrogens, and that makes it able to form hydrogen bonds better with the water and makes it dissolve better. So there are procedures that you can use by adding acid or adding base can allow you to extract like the active ingredient that way as well. It's not done a lot in herbal medicine, but it can be. And then finally, the size of the solvent. Generally speaking, if you're using a solvent that's small, like if you look at water, you basically have one oxygen and a couple hydrogens on it. That's like a really tiny molecule. So it's able to interact around the various phytochemicals to form the hydrogen bonds and to help dissolve it. If you were to look at things like olive oil, it's not a bad solvent, but it has basically, let's say the oleic acid is like 18 carbons in length. It's a fairly large molecule. Or use something like a wax. So wax has like 30 molecules. These are such large compounds that they're not as good at absorbing things as you would get from a smaller molecule. So when it comes to herbal medicine, well, as a chemist, I've used hundreds of different solvents in my past to extract things when I'm trying to do a preparation. And you have lots of options as a chemist. As a herbalist, you have less actions because you don't want to use toxic solvents that will kill people to do a particular extraction. So the main solvents that people use is things like water or glycerol, alcohol, or various oils and fats. And I'll go through the different types of solvents and explain the benefits of them. So a polar solvent, as I mentioned already, is something like water. Water is like the most polar thing. The most non-polar thing on the other end of the spectrum would be something like turpentine. And so at the bottom left, you can see pinene. That's all carbons and hydrogens. Water is no carbons. So non-polar solvents basically are primarily carbons, and they have very little, if any, oxygen molecules. The polar would be water on the other extreme. Other polar solvents could be something like vinegar or glycerol. And if you look at glycerol, glycerol has a ratio of 1 oxygen to 1 carbon. Ethanol has a ratio of 2 carbons to 1 oxygen. It's a little more non-polar than glycerol is. And as you go down, oleic acid, like an olive oil, it's got 2 oxygens for 18 carbons. It's not very, it's a 1 to 9 ratio, while pinene or turpentine is basically 100% carbons with 0 oxygens. So based on that, you can look at this and say, water is a great solvent for polar things. Turpentine would be great, although it's kind of toxic. You wouldn't use that for non-polar things. Alcohol, it's nice because it's somewhat non-polar and also very polar. So it's a great solvent to get some of the fat-soluble things, because those 2 carbons on there allow you to dissolve some of the fat-soluble things. And it's relatively safe to consume. Glycerol is sometimes used because not everyone wants to take alcohol if it's for religious purposes or children. But it's not as good a solvent as ethanol is. It's also more expensive. Okay? So based on this, I'm going to show you some examples of how polar dissolves, or like dissolves like. So we'll look at different kind of solvents to find the best one for a particular phytochemical. So here I took turmeric and I put it in a test tube, and then I added water to the different solvents. And the reason why I chose turmeric is visible with your eye. So you can see how much is going to dissolve in this solvent based on the color change. So it's a nice bright yellow color, and when it becomes really concentrated, it almost looks red in color. And so on the left-hand side, these test tubes have been super saturated with turmeric. So on the left, I've used water. You can see there's a little bit of yellow in the water. So that means the active ingredient, curcumin, which is found in turmeric, some of it's dissolved in there. But if you look at the curcumin molecule at the top, and you do a quick little count on the number of carbons to oxygens, here you've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, and 6, 20, 21, 22. I think it's about roughly 20, let's say 21 carbons to make it easy, and there's about 2, 4, 6. So the ratio of oxygens to carbons is about 1 to 3 ratio, is roughly, it's not quite, but roughly it's that. And so I would just predict that the best solvent for this would probably be something that has 3 carbons to 1 oxygen. And when you start looking at the bottom of the page, water does an okay job because it does have some polar compounds in there, the oxygens. And then you can move over to the ethanol. Ethanol definitely has a more of a non-polar effect there, so you're going to dissolve some more of these compounds as well. You can see the color changing. And then you get the isopropyl alcohol, which is toxic and you can't consume this. And but isopropyl alcohol has 3 carbons to 1 oxygen. This is kind of the best match for this phytochemical here. We just can't use it because it'll kill you. But this would be the best solvent for this if you were able to drink it. And if you kept going and used, for example, turpentine, it barely dissolves any of the active ingredients as well. Because it's almost too polar. It's a little bit darker than water, but it's not. I didn't show it here. So in this case, the best sort of solvent is going to be somewhere between the extremes of like benzene or turpentine and water. So this gives you an idea how much of it dissolves is on the left-hand side, and as you move along here, you can see water a little bit dissolves, glycerates a little bit will, ethanol more will, propanol you'll probably get your best bet there. And then if you continue along and use solvents that have more carbons and less oxygens, eventually you get down to like oil, some type of oil. It won't be the best solvent. So what that means is alcohol is not always the best solvent. Sometimes water will be a better solvent. Sometimes oil will be a better solvent. If you look at the bottom here, here's like a anthocyanin. There's a compound that has lots of oxygen molecules on it. These are like typical flavonoid-like compounds. And for example, if you take blueberries and you pour hot water, you'll see the water changes color and becomes blue. That's because they have these active ingredients, and often they'll have sugars attached onto it as well, which makes it even more water soluble. And so in this case, something like wine, which is, let's say 18% alcohol or 16% alcohol, it's a great solvent for dissolving those nice blue and red colors, or basically red, purple colors that you get in wine, in grapes and berries. And so if you try to put blueberries in, let's say, olive oil and do an extraction, it just wouldn't work. Another example would be, here is lycopene. And so if you look at the structure of lycopene at the bottom here, there's no carbons, or there's no oxygens at all in this molecule. It's 100% carbons. And so as a result, there is absolutely, lycopene will not dissolve at all in the water. And if you had an alcohol extract, some of it will get dissolved. And then when you get into like things like olive oil, you get a very good extraction. Now, when you, just as an aside, when you drink tomato juice, it's not pure lycopene. There's it's kind of like almost like an emulsion, like mayonnaise or something, where there's probably little droplets of fat-soluble compounds suspended in a water mixture. And that's a little bit different than just trying to do the extraction yourself. So when it comes to herbal extracts, we'll discuss a few different ways that you can extract the active ingredients. Water, tincture, fluid extracts, essential oils, oil infusions. I'll discuss that. So when it comes to water extracts, one of the first things you can do is use cold water. So a cold water extract is you basically take a cup of like a glass of cold water, and you add a teaspoon of herbs to it, and you mix it up. And the reason why you use cold water over, let's say, hot water is that for some reason you were trying to not dissolve some of the certain compounds, like let's say the tannins in a particular plant, then using cold water, one, it's just convenient, and two, it might be easier to consume because you just want to be able to drink it. Three, you may not want to extract certain compounds from it. So where you'd use this is primarily to extract mucilage. That's the main thing. Mucilage is a type of fiber that you want to get from certain plants like marshmallow or slippery elm. And so using cold water is a fine way to do it. You can just add a spoonful of it to some water, you mix it up, and it slowly starts to basically form like a gel-like mucilage in there. And so adding hot water is just not necessary and adds another step. So the main advantage is when you do like a cold water extract is you can use pretty much any plant part. It's inexpensive. You get good patient compliance. It's good to extract carbohydrates in particular. But beyond that, it's not really useful for other phytochemicals. So for something like turmeric, you know, adding it to cold water, you're not really going to dissolve the active ingredient very well by doing that. So cold water infusions is exclusively for mucilage. That's kind of the take home. You can do hot water extractions. The first one is an infusion, or just basically making a cup of tea. And so in general, if you want to make chamomile, peppermint, or caffeinated tea like black tea or green tea, you basically add roughly a teaspoon of the plant material to a cup of water, hot water. So you add the water to the tea, you let it sit for a few minutes, or maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then you filter it off, and then you can drink that. And so you can use this extraction primarily for the aerial parts. So this is the parts that grow above ground. Flowers, berries, leaves, things like that. It does a pretty good job of extracting it. The main advantage of this is it's very inexpensive to, for example, buy chamomile tea, because water is dirt cheap and chamomile is relatively inexpensive. You can buy 100 grams easily for $5. If you're using a extract like a tincture, alcohol extract of chamomile, the same amount, if you're using like 100 grams, is probably going to cost about 40 or 50 bucks, maybe even 80 bucks for the patient to take it. And the reason for that is you're paying mostly for the alcohol. So hot water infusions, teas, and the other ones we're going to talk about is very inexpensive. You get good compliance, mainly because it's not very difficult to make. It's not the best for extracting certain types of phenolic compounds. Like, you don't really make a tea from turmeric. It's not a great way to extract the phytochemicals from turmeric. But when it comes to certain things like flavonoids, when you make a cup of chamomile tea, it turns all yellow. That's probably from a lot of the flavonoids that are in there that are dissolving. And so it's pretty good for getting various things like carbohydrates and glycosides and certain polyphenolic compounds. We're going to discuss these more in the second half of the course. So tea is great for that. Not as good for fat-soluble compounds. Now, that being said, when you make a cup of peppermint tea, you'll see that it's an effective way to get the active ingredients out. Some of those active ingredients are what are called the essential oils. These are very small fat-soluble compounds that they will evaporate off, make it smell very nice and aromatic and minty. The minty smell is from these compounds. When you make a cup of peppermint tea, you are extracting these things, but appreciate they're not dissolving in the water. They form like two layers. You may have little droplets of these essential oils trapped in the water, or they'll just sort of form at the surface of the tea. So if you let it stand long enough, you'll see the two layers will kind of start to separate. You'll have this thin little layer of essential oils at the top. And if you leave it long enough, it'll eventually evaporate off. So that being said, some of these oils, they can be extracted from the leaf, but they won't necessarily dissolve in the water. Okay. So the main disadvantage of using teas is you can't really make teas very well out of bark unless you break it into smaller pieces. So roots and barks, you gotta boil it longer. So either that, or you have to shave it and make it into like a fine powder or small little shavings. It's also not suitable for fat-soluble compounds. And sometimes people don't like the taste of chamomile, or they might not like the taste of other herbs. So I don't use them a lot in practice, but there are a handful of teas. We have a whole shelf of teas that we recommend to patients. And we do prescribe them, like hibiscus tea for blood pressure or chamomile tea for digestive issues. But But some people are just too lazy. They don't want to make up the tea, or they don't like the taste of chamomile, so your compliance goes down. So you have to give a different type of preparation to them. Now, another water extract is what's called a decoction. And the difference between a decoction and a tea or an infusion is when you make an infusion, you're basically adding the hot water to the plant and then letting it sit. With the case of the decoction, what you do is you boil up your water, you throw your roots or your bark into it, and then you cover it and you let it basically boil for anywhere between 10 minutes to 4 or 5 hours. And so extracting the active ingredients using decoction, the main benefits, or the main reason why I use this is for bark, roots, rhizomes, things like that. It's great because it's inexpensive. By boiling it for a long period of time, you're kind of breaking down the fibrous material in the bark and then the roots and the rhizomes. It's good, again, for the water-soluble components. Some of the phenol compounds will get there. The disadvantage is if you were to boil, let's say, peppermint tea for 4 or 5 hours on the stove, if you came home, your apartment would smell great, but the tea would basically be pretty bitter and it wouldn't have those aromatic oils because they will evaporate off. So you will lose some of the essential oils when you make a decoction. Another disadvantage for the same thing that we just described is that those volatile compounds, they will evaporate off, and in some cases makes the house smell bad. Not all teas smell good. And so if you go down to Chinatown and you get a bunch of herbs, or you see a Chinese doctor, they'll give you a bag of herbs that you have to boil and make decoctions with, and they'll sit on your stove for 3 or 4 hours. I remember doing this as a student, just as I was experimenting with all the different things, and I saw a herbalist or something. And when I made these decoctions up, the whole house stunk. And so my roommates that weren't naturopaths weren't very fond of decoctions because it made everything kind of smell funny. And then you had to drink it, which it didn't taste very good either. So the fact that it can make your house smell and it doesn't taste very good, patient compliance goes down significantly when you're trying to do decoctions. Now, just as an aside, we haven't talked about saponins yet, but there are certain phytochemicals that form soaps when you add them to water. And it may be that in Chinese formulas, these saponins, or herbal soaps, might help to dissolve some of the fat-soluble components in the roots and in the bark and in the plants. And so this may be one reason why in Chinese medicine, by combining different herbs together, they're able to get a significant extraction of the active ingredients that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were to use one herb alone that had the fat-soluble components but didn't contain saponins, and maybe you wouldn't be able to get the proper extraction. So it's interesting when you look at Western herbalism, we use a lot of tinctures. Chinese herbalism, they use more decoctions. One, because it's cheaper, and I guess that's the main thing. So I've got a question here. So when steeping teas, Nicole is asking this, should the top of the mug be covered so those oils or other components don't evaporate? I would say it's a good idea. Depends on what you're trying to make. If you're making peppermint tea or chamomile tea, it's nice to cover it up so they don't evaporate off. You will lose a percentage of them, but you're not going to lose all of them if you don't cover it up. So if you're making a single cup, then I think it's a good idea. It'll make the tea taste a little bit better, but again, depending on how long it's sitting there, you're not going to lose all the essential oils, but you will lose some for sure. The next thing we're going to talk about are glycerate extracts. Oh, can you store it? Question is, Anna's asking, can you store a decoction for long term? I would say decoctions can probably be, you can easily store them in the fridge for a few days, 2 or 3 days, but definitely not more than a week or so. I think it would depend on what type of herbs you're using, but generally speaking, 2 to 4 days maximum, I would think. You could freeze it if you wanted to after you made it, would be fine. But in the fridge alone, they contain lots of various nutrients, so some kind of bacteria or bug are going to want to, or yeast are going to want to ferment. So glycerates. Oops. Let me go back here. Glycerates. So when you looked at the molecule of a glycerate molecule, glycerol is the backbone for fat. So what you basically have when you have a fat is a glycerol molecule, which has basically 3 carbons with an OH group attached to each carbon, and then fatty acids join onto that, and that's how you make fat. So if you remove the fatty acids from fat and you're left over with a glycerol, that glycerol can be used as a solvent called glycerate, and it can be used as a solvent for extracting herbs. There are certain herbal companies that sell glycerate extracts. They tend to be, the advantage of them is that if someone has an aversion to alcohol, they're good to use. Children, I don't really care if children get a little bit of alcohol. It's not a big deal in my opinion. Obviously, you don't want your kids, drinking a bottle of wine a day, but getting a half a teaspoon of alcohol is not the end of the world. If you are concerned about that, then all you have to do is add the tincture to, let's say, a cup of boiling water, and then they can take it that way. Generally speaking, children don't particularly like tinctures and herbal extracts because they taste bad anyways, but glycerates would be one option for them. It's a little bit better extraction than doing basically water extracts because glycerates are a little more non-polar or fat soluble than water is, but not nearly as good as alcohol. Easier for patients if they can just do an extract that way. The disadvantage is that these tinctures tend to be these glycerate extracts tend to be more expensive than tinctures, and they're not as good a solvent as basically alcohol or ethanol is. So I don't love them. I don't really use them very often. I find occasionally I use them, but it's more for people that are alcoholics and I don't have another way to do it, or people who have a religious reason for not drinking alcohol, then I use it. So not my favorite. Alcohol extracts. So tinctures tend to be the most common extract that I would use that are like a liquid extract or like a liquid extract is different than a fluid extract. But anyways, alcohol-based solvents are probably the best way to do it. Typically, you're using about 40% ethanol when you're doing these extractions, usually just by pre-made tinctures. And the ratio of herbs to solvent is usually a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. And so what that means is using 1 part herb, so to 4 parts of solvent. So if you jump down to the bottom of the page, if I want to make a liter of tincture, if I'm using a 1 to 4 tincture, what that means is I got to use 4 times as much alcohol. So I use 250 grams, times that by 4, you get 1,000. 1 gram is equal to 1,000 mil, more or less. Depends if you're using water or alcohol, but anyways. So 250 grams of herb is used to make about a liter of tincture. If you're making 1 to 5, then you're using about 200 grams of herb. Now, in some cases, it doesn't sound very concentrated when you're talking about a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, but appreciate the alcohol has a solvent capacity. There's only so much stuff that can dissolve in it, first of all. And the second thing is when you make a tincture up, you kind of run out of room when you're trying to make it in the actual jar. So if this is like, let's say if I'm trying to make a tincture using a jar like this, if I try to pack in here, and this, let's say this is a liter, if I try to pack in 200 grams of herb, it's going to fill right up to the top, pretty much, with the herbs, and then you throw the alcohol on top. What will happen is, if I add more than 200 or 250 grams of the herbs, the alcohol won't be able to cover all the herbs. There's going to be herbs that are going to be above the liquid, which isn't good because it's not really extracting properly. So if you try to make like a 1 to 2 tincture extract doing that, only half of the herbs would be covered with alcohol. So it's pretty hard to go much higher than 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 tinctures. You might be able to go get a 1 to 3 if you use like a powder herb, but it's challenging. So what you basically do is, if you want to make it at home, easy. Grab a liter of alcohol. You can use alcohol, you can use vodka. If you go down to Cuba, buy some rum for $5 or $3, buy a whole bunch. take your 250 grams to 200 grams of herb, pack it in a mason jar, pour your alcohol on top, seal it, and then you just have to shake it. And then leave it for a little bit of time, maybe a few weeks. Technically speaking, a lot of the extraction is going to be done like probably in the first, even as soon as you have the alcohol, you're going to see it changes color right away. But I usually leave it for a couple of weeks and then give it a stir or give it a shake from time to time. And then what you do after that is you basically get a big bowl out, put some cheesecloth down, dump the combination on it, grab the cheesecloth and just sort of squeeze it out. And then what comes out is your tincture that you can then bottle. One of the main disadvantages of making the tincture is the fact that the extraction process is hard to get 100%. It's impossible to get 100% of your alcohol back because a lot of it will stay inside the herbs. So when you start off with a liter of vodka, in the end, you're lucky if you're getting like 700 mils of tincture out of it. You got to squeeze it all out. It's pretty challenging. So there's a lot of material that gets wasted when you're making a tincture. The alcohol is very, very expensive. So that's the main, one of the main disadvantages of it. The advantage is it's easy to give the patients. That's the one thing. They don't always like the taste of it, but taking a spoonful of the tincture is really, really useful. The other advantage is it's way better than water is for extracting these phenolic or these fat-soluble compounds. You're going to get a much better concentrated tincture. So that's a good thing. It's pretty low processing, pretty easy to make. Anybody can make this at home. It's not difficult at all. Patients, they just open up their container of the tincture and they just take it nice and easy. And it's going to have a longer shelf life than, let's say, teas would. The main disadvantages, so you got the alcohol, so that means that some people don't want to take it or they don't like it. Alcohol is very expensive. So to put it in perspective, a liter of tincture might cost anywhere between $50 to $100. So it depends on who's buying it, what size. Like if you're buying it, you can buy I think at the health food store they were selling 50 ml bottles of tinctures for about $25. That's really expensive, right? So that's only 50 mils. We were buying it for probably between $50 and $100 per liter. So it's very expensive when people are buying it. You're lucky to be able to get a 100 ml tincture of herbs for under 25 bucks. Usually we sell 250 mils for about 40 bucks to patients, and that's really cheap. To contrast that, if you were to buy 250 grams of dried herbs, that's probably going to cost you maybe 10 bucks. Depends on the type of herb you're using. Some herbs it could be 4 times that, but let's say standard herbs might be anywhere between 5 and 20 bucks. So that means when you're buying a tincture, you're paying somewhere between 2 and 10 times as much just because of the alcohol. I'd say about 5 times as much, and that's because of the alcohol in there. So alcohol is expensive. If you go down to Cuba, if you look in the local pharmacies, they actually have tinctures for sales in a lot of those local pharmacies because drugs are expensive. And for a 100 ml bottle up here, it costs, if you're lucky, let's say 25 bucks. Down there, a 100 ml bottle of herbal tinctures costs about, I think it was 30 cents. And that's because in Cuba they got cheap labor and they got cheap rum and they got lots of land for growing things. So, alcohol up in Canada is heavily taxed. That's why it's so expensive. But if you want to get alcohol, you can also, I have a license with the LCBO. You have to apply for it, where I can get like 100% pure alcohol. It's far more cost effective if you're doing it that way, if you're doing it on a larger scale. So you can make all your own tinctures for your practice and do it for much cheaper than you can buy it from the various herbal suppliers. It just takes time. You need the space. It takes a little bit of tinkering around. Just for me, it's not worth doing. I've done it, but it's not. I'm just too busy in practice to be running a herbal manufacturing facility and seeing patients. So you can see here, you take the 200 grams of herbs, you got your solvents, you mix them together, you let it sit for a little bit, you filter it, You get your tincture, which is going to be about a 1 to 5 concentration, and then you throw away the other remaining maceration into the garbage. So just remember, 1 to 5, 1 to 4. You should be able to do a calculation. If I said, how many grams of herb do you need to make a 1 to 5 tincture? You should be able to take 1,000 milliliters divided by 5, and that's your answer. Would you trust using the tinctures from down in Cuba or Mexico, though? Well, that's a good question. Would I? I wouldn't really use it for my patients, I don't think. I mean, the markup would be like 10,000% if you got the tinctures down there, brought them up here, snuck them in, and sold it for $25. You'd be making an awfully good profit. But the reality is they're probably fine, but I just don't know. So I wouldn't go there. I'd buy a few for myself, and I did, a couple of ginger extracts and stuff like that, but I wouldn't bother with the patients. Al is asking, what's the minimum amount of time you want to let the herbs sit in the solvent to get your extract? There's no minimal time. If you had like powdered herbs and you added the alcohol to it, instead of using like the leaf for coarse roots and stuff like that, it would be ready, I would say instantaneously almost. You could just see from the color change. So powder and alcohol, mix it up together, just shake it for maybe 10 minutes, you're probably good to go. If you're using roots or bark and it's really coarse and chunky pieces, it's going to take, I would say, weeks under those situations. Powdered herbs usually cost more than like the bark and stuff like that. Now, fluid extract, I'm just going to jump to the next slide. The difference between a fluid extract and tincture is related to the concentration, how much herb you're using. So in this case, generally speaking, you're using a much higher concentration of herbs than in the tinctures. So you might end up using twice as much herb to make your fluid extract. Now the tricky thing here is, if you're using twice as much herb, then like I mentioned before, if this is a liter, I might only be able to pack in 400 or 200 grams of herbs before the alcohol won't cover it anymore. So if I wanted to make it even stronger and use 400 grams of herb, what that means is if this is a liter, I might have half of my bottle, like it's in a call, isn't basically being covered by the alcohol. So the only way you can really do a fluid or do an extraction that's going to be more concentrated than a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 is by a fluid extract. There's a couple ways that you do that, but you basically have to move the solvent continuously over top of the plant material. So in the picture that I'm showing here, one way of doing that would be to just create a pump where you're constantly pumping and flowing the solvent over top of the herbs in order to do the extraction. Or maybe you put it in a jar like this and you're constantly, there's some kind of motion involved in order to be doing your extraction that way. So it just can't sit like that because it won't fully cover all the herb. So the main benefit of the fluid extract is you get a much stronger concentration. And what I like about that is then you can give less to the patient. So, because there's a certain point where if you're trying to do a herbal formula and you've got 5 different herbs in it, you might require the patient to be drinking 1 tablespoon 3 times a day. And a tablespoon of 40% alcohol, you start your day with that on an empty stomach, you're going to feel a little bit loopy by the time you start eating breakfast. So too much alcohol can be a little bit intense, but if you're getting into a fluid extract, you're able to maybe give significantly less of the alcohol to the patient. Now going back to a lot of the fluid extracts that you're going to buy would be a 1 to 1 or a 1 to 2 concentration. So they could be using as much as equal parts solvent to herbs to make it, or maybe twice as much solvent to the one part of the alcohol. So usually it's still using about 40% alcohol. So it's great. People have to take less. You don't have to use as much alcohol, so it can be a little bit You can save some money there. But the disadvantage with it, it's a little bit trickier to make. So this isn't something that you can't just grab a couple mason jars and do it as easily. That's the one thing. So it requires it's a little more sophisticated extraction process. You're also wasting more of the herbal stuff. Generally speaking, fluid extracts are more expensive than tinctures, but you can use less, which is good. Sometimes they may be using other things like heating or vacuums that can affect the preparations as well. But the one thing I want to emphasize is that when it comes to a fluid extract, if a fluid extract is a 1-to-1 concentration and a tincture is a 1-to-5 concentration, you can't just take the dosage you'd normally use for the tincture. Let's say if it was 5 mils a day, you can't just divide it by 5 with the 1-to-1. So 1-to-5 concentration, 1-to-1 concentration doesn't mean the dosage you give your patient is just divided by 5. And the reason for that is, if you remember, things aren't always linear. When it comes to solvents, the amount of solutes, the amount of herbs that the solvent can dissolve will start to plateau off. And so, just like when we're talking about if you're absorbing vitamin C, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C versus 50 milligrams of vitamin C isn't 20 times as much that gets into your system. It may be doubles, but it's not 20 times as much. And the difference between 1,000 milligrams and 10,000 milligrams, if you took it at one dose, the amount that gets into your body probably doesn't change at all. Another comparison would be, think about if you have like a cup of coffee, you add 1 tablespoon of sugar to it, which you should never do. But anyways, if you have 1 tablespoon of sugar to your coffee, you add your second tablespoon of sugar, you add a third tablespoon. It doesn't mean that the coffee gets 3 times as sweet by the time you add the third or fourth or fifth tablespoon of sugar, because eventually the sugar can no longer dissolve and it starts to basically just fall to the bottom of the cup. So a fluid extract of 1-to-1 is not 5 times as potent. They use 5 times as much material, but it's not 5 times as potent. So therefore, to figure out the dosage you want to use to give to your patient, you should look at the dosages. And there are specific dosages if you're using a fluid extract compared to using a tincture. In some cases, it might be twice. You might have to use half as much. But in other cases, you might have to use half as much if it's a 1-to-2 fluid extract compared to a 1-to-4 tincture. But in other cases, it's not quite that. So a fluid extract dosage could be, let's say, for a 1-to-1, it could be a few different variations that it's not necessarily linear. Maybe you're using half as much, but you're not using a quarter as much, okay? So make sure you look at the dosages in the book and don't just take the tincture dose and divide it by 4 or 5 or whatever it is, okay? Now we'll take a break here, and then we'll do salt extracts. Hopefully that makes sense. So take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11, okay? Okay, you guys ready? So, the next thing we'll talk about is solid extracts. So remember, in tinctures you can have one part one part herb to 4 parts solvent. When you're getting into a solid extract, you can have as much as 4 parts of the herb for 1 part of the solvent. So it's kind of like the ratio is flipped there. And there's a few different ways that these can be made. They could be using, let's say, solvents to do the extraction, and then under a low temperature with a vacuum, they might evaporate off the whatever solvent they could be using, including ethanol, or they could be using other commercial solvents as well. The benefit of doing salt extracts, you're able to get a very, very highly concentrated product in the end. And so these salt extracts can then be put into capsules or tablets, and it's an easy way to sort of administer it that way as well. Sometimes you can get salt extracts or like a liquid that ends up, you might take, for example, a decoction or something else, and then boil it down really, really concentrated. So at the end, you just kind of have this thick syrup at the end. And that would also be a salt extract. The main benefit is you can basically recover some of the solvents that you use, like the ethanol, so you can recycle it. You can put it in different kind of pill forms. The disadvantage tends to be more expensive, and sometimes the active ingredients can be damaged during the process. And so when you look at the extraction process, it's kind of like doing a liquid extract or a solvent, and then after you get your final product at the end, your liquid here, then what you do is, with using a vacuum and a little bit of heat, you might evaporate off the solvent, recollect that, and then concentrate it down. Now, one thing that's you'll see a lot of products on the market are labeled as is that they contain a standardized extract. Standardized extracts basically means on the outside of the bottle it will say there is, let's say, 5% of the active ingredient or 95% of the active ingredient. And so the main advantage of doing this, is you can do it with a liquid or a solid, is that it ensures that the desired active ingredient is inside the preparation at a certain concentration. And so this means that you kind of know what you're paying for. So you know that you want to have 5 milligrams or 25 milligrams of an active ingredient. This particular product has it, so that's good. So it's great if you're doing research studies. So you can say, we did a standardized extract containing 50 milligrams or 50% of the active ingredient. Then it's easy then to know in the future for dosing to say, like, well, we know that it works when you take 3 caps that are 95% of the active ingredients, but it doesn't work if you take, 2 caps if it's 20% or whatever. So it's much easier to dose things when you know what whether it's standardized. The other advantage is there's products on the market that, for example, lots of ginseng teas on the market don't actually contain significant amounts of ginseng. May not contain any ginseng at all, so that's a bit of an issue. So standardization is kind of a good idea, in my opinion, in some ways. The disadvantage with standardization is it costs a lot of money to actually go through the processing because it requires lab equipment and you have to hire someone to look at it. And the other thing that I don't like about it, and a lot of herbalists don't like about it, is that it's possible to have a standardized extract, but it's not necessarily reflective of what it's like to give a whole herb. So if you gave, for example, 95% curcumin extract, it's not the same thing as giving a capsule that contains the turmeric rhizome, because the rhizome will contain not just the curcumin, but it will also contain carbohydrates, essential oils, and other phenolic compounds. And so appreciate when you buy a curcumin extract on the market, it does have potent anti-inflammatory effects. And when it comes to turmeric, one of the main active ingredients in the turmeric plant is the curcumin molecule. But there are other curcuminoids, other molecules that have anti-inflammatory effects beyond just curcumin itself. And the other thing to consider is that some of the carbohydrates research show that a carbohydrate component, which is totally different than the curcumin molecules, also possess a anti-inflammatory effect as well. And the essential oils have medicinal properties as well. So although curcumin is a great molecule, it's not the only molecule in turmeric that has medicinal properties. And that doesn't mean that taking a curcumin supplement that's standardized at 95% is bad. It doesn't mean that it's good. It just means that a 95% standardized curcumin extract is different than taking 2 to 4 grams of turmeric rhizome. So appreciate that you're kind of comparing, it's not apples and oranges per se, it's more comparing like apples to apple peel. You know, it's just, they're not quite the same thing. And so the dosage and the therapeutic indications for one may not apply to the other one. One of the other things that you don't tend to get if you have, let's say, pure extract of something is that you may not get some of the synergy that exists within the herbal extracts. So when we were talking about golden seal and barberry in the past, we talked about one active ingredient, the berberine, that acts as an antibacterial. And we talked about another compound called flavonolignin, 5-MHC, that acts as a multi-drug pump inhibitor. And so if you were to take 100% berberine alone, it would not be as effective as a product that had, let's say, 20% berberine, but also contained the flavonolignin. So just appreciate, you know, standardization's good, but it can also be misleading as well. The final thing that can happen is when you're doing a standardized extract is if the herbal preparation had very low amounts of a particular active ingredient, then what could happen is the manufacturer could decide to add extra, let's say, curcumin to the molecule. So if you made an extract that was only 80% curcumin in it, you could just buy pure curcumin and spike it with that, and then get it up to 95%. And what would actually happen under certain situations, it could falsely elevate the properties of the herb. So if normally, and I'm going to move on to the next one, if you can look at this, if normally a herbal extract from, let's say, Chinese skullcap contains all these little spikes, and this is what HPLC, I used to do this when I was a chemist. You run like an extract from Chinese skullcap through, you're getting all these different peaks, and these are different flavonoids that exist in there. And so here's 2 main flavonoids. And so the top one is what the whole herb looks like, and the bottom one is the 95% pure extract. And you can see the 95% extract, it has higher amounts of the baicalin, but this other flavonoid here and these other little peaks aren't found in the 95% extract. So, you know, that's a bit of an issue. What some companies are doing is they'll do a characterized extract. And I don't know if that term's caught on yet or not, but what they'll do is they'll do the traditional herbal extract, but instead of you know, standardizing the 95%, they use the whole herbal mixture, and they'll say, we guarantee it's been extracted in the standardized fashion with at least 30 or 40% of the active ingredient, or whatever it may be. And that's going to be a better way of doing it. So I do like the idea when it's basically being done with the traditional extraction processes and telling you what's in it, but I don't want people to go and spike it. Now, someone said this sounds glitchy. So I'm going to turn off my handsome face and just put on the screen for you guys, see if that works better. Okay. Okay. Herbal formulas. So there's different ways that you can do extracts using oil. So don't forget, oil is non-polar, it's fat soluble. So the first thing we have here is essential oils. So the way that you obtain essential oils is you basically put a whole bunch of herbs in this little container here, you blast steam through it. The essential oils, they have a boiling point, usually usually around 300 degrees Celsius, but you still will get a lot of these guys evaporating off at 100 degrees. I mean, it's not going to evaporate as much as water does, but you still get some. So what happens is when these essential oils evaporate off, they fall down through a tube here. That cold water is poured into this little chamber here, so it cools it down, so the steam basically precipitates down. And at the bottom, you basically get a collection of the essential oil and the steam, like the water vapor at the bottom, that you can then easily separate the two. So this is a pretty easy little extraction if you've got the equipment to do it and you've got the time. Essential oils, as I mentioned before, they're very potent. So when you're getting an essential oil, you're basically getting like 100% of the volatile components from the plant in your preparation. You're not going to get the flavonoids, you're not going to get the carbohydrates, you're not going to get really large lipid molecules. In general, the types of compounds that you're extracting are usually between about 5 to 15 carbons in length. You're not getting things much bigger than that. And there's a number of different phytochemicals we'll talk about in the second half of the term. Monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, phenylpropenes, coumarins, these are all going to be found in the essential oils. So the advantage with this is that you have a very potentized extract of these essential oils that you can then add little drop dosages to various things or apply it to creams and other preparations. The disadvantages, they can be a little irritating to the skin or the mucous membranes if you don't dilute it. And as I mentioned last time, even a teaspoon of certain essential oils can be toxic. You use a lot of plant material to make the essential oils. So in some cases, you could be using pounds and pounds of the raw material, the herb, in order to make even 1 teaspoon of the essential oils. So they can be very expensive as well. But they're useful, and I do use oregano oil, tea tree oil, lavender oil, eucalyptus, or a whole bunch of them. They're definitely used in practice. Appreciate, though, taking the essential oil of peppermint is not the same as drinking peppermint tea, because when you have peppermint tea, you're only getting a small amount of the peppermint essential oil, but you're also getting flavonoids that have other benefits as well too, and some other compounds as well. So that's an essential oil. Now, fixed oil, it's different. Fixed oils, these are very, very large molecules. So here we've got a structure here. This is the glycerol at the bottom of this, basically this oil here. These are the fatty acids that are attached to it. So a fixed oil is basically some type of vegetable oil that has the glycerol as a backbone and then little fatty acids attached to it. And so the classic things are going to be things extracted from fruits and nuts and seeds. So you're looking at olive oil, coconut oil, sunflower seed oil, flaxseed oil. That's basically what they do. The way you extract these, you just take these guys and you basically squeeze them, preferably under low temperature, and then basically get the oils off. You can't get any of the water off of it. In general, you can also use some of these fixed oils as a solvent for other things. So olive oil is often used for making certain herbal preparations. No major disadvantages apart from the fact that if you're looking at a certain omega oil, so if you're looking at omega-3s and omega-6s, even omega-9s in olive oil, when you expose unsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acids to air and light, they can go rancid. So you have to keep them in, store them in, preferably in dark bottles and away from too much oxygen. So castor oil is another form of herbal extract that you'd use that for. So it's used both in cooking and in herbal medicine. Oil infusion. So what an oil infusion is, instead of using water or alcohol as a solvent, you're basically using oil. And so this works great for certain compounds that are not very polar. So non-polar fat-soluble compounds can be extracted with this. So the two pictures I have shown there, these are two fixed oils that have basically, you've got olive oil that I've just basically extracted St. John's wort and marigold or calendula to make basically an oil infusion. And so the way you do this is pretty much the same way you make a tincture. You take a bottle, you pack it full of flowers, and in this case, St. John's wort flowers, they have this yellowy red color to them. And when you add the oil to it, over time, you basically dissolve the hypericin and some of the other compounds in it to give that nice red color that you get. Calendula or marigold, it has more of a yellowy orange color to it. And both these are great to be applied, added to creams or applied topically for burns and for wound healing and a number of other things. So it's pretty easy to make. The main advantages, you're going to be extracting those fat-soluble compounds that you may not be able to get out very effectively with alcohol and water. It can also be used both internally or externally. So you could take olive oil, you can infuse it with things like rosemary and other spices and take it internally for just to flavor your food, but it also has lots of good anti-cancer and antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties. This often is also used as a base to make other topical preparations. So St. John's wort, marigold, arnica, comfrey, all those different oils that you can do as an extraction, you can just basically tweak them, add a few things to it to make something else from it. Not a lot of disadvantages. The only main disadvantage with using these oils is they take longer to make than an alcohol extract, because olive oil is such a large molecule that it takes longer to do the extraction than you will if you're just using alcohol. So I find this could take weeks and weeks to get the extraction done versus just hours or days. The other thing is that it's completely useless if you were trying to get, the flavonoids don't really dissolve very well. Like certain phenolic compounds won't dissolve that well in oil. So it's sort of reserved for the big non-polar compounds or small non-polar compounds as well. So here's basically what you do is you take the flowers for, let's say, calendula on the left-hand side, put them in a jar, just pack it full of flowers, throw the olive oil on top, let it sit for a few weeks, maybe a couple months, and then you just separate and squeeze out the oil from the flowers, and then you got your oil infusion. Now, once you have this, you can use it for other things. Now, we're going to talk about some topical applications. We're going to talk about some herbs that are commonly used topically. So the main thing that you use herbs topically for will be burns, wound healing, ulcers, warts, eczema, muscle pain, neuropathies, bruises, arthritis, various fissures, and varicose veins. And so there's some herbal actions I want to talk about. Just a second, before I go on this, I got one question asking a question. There's lots of discrepancies about using coconut oil for cooking. Many say you should only use it topically. My naturopath has told me to always cook with oils that are solid at room temperature. What's your take on this? Really quickly with regards to coconut oil, the American Heart Association released a statement a few weeks, maybe months ago now, saying that coconut oil has never been a healthy oil. You shouldn't be using it in cooking. The reason why they said that is coconut oil, it elevates both good and bad cholesterol. And so the concern is that because it elevates the bad cholesterol, it's bad for the heart. I've gone and looked at all the research on coconut oil. What I can say about coconut oil is, with regards to its health benefits for the heart, it doesn't really have any benefit or doesn't really cause any harm against the heart. So if you look at people who consume a lot of coconut oil, it doesn't seem to increase the risk of heart disease. Coconut oil does help with weight loss. It does have some antifungal properties, but it's more or less a neutral oil for the heart. If you were to look at something like olive oil, though, and avocado oil, those are great oils for your heart. So I would recommend those. A little bit of coconut oil in your diet is not going to hurt you. Somebody's MD said to only cook with oils that are solid at room temperature. I don't think there's anything, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Anyways, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say ridiculous. It's olive oil, we know, is such a good oil You can use olive oil for low temperature cooking and medium temperature cooking. It's fairly stable. They've been using it in the Mediterranean for hundreds, if not thousands of years for that. It's not the best one for high temperature cooking because it does have, can smoke and then become carcinogenic. Avocado oil has a higher smoke point, so it's better for barbecuing than olive oil is. Coconut oil, it doesn't have a smoke point as high as the avocado oil. So coconut's okay to cook with, but it still has a pretty low smoke point compared to avocado oil. So anyways, I'm not against avocado oil, it's fine. Or not coconut oil, it's fine, a little bit of that would be fine. Someone's also asking, is there any benefit from consuming an oil infusion? Yeah, you would get those properties from taking an oil infusion. So if you had an ulcer or something, you could take an infusion of calendula from an oil infusion. It would have health benefits. So I'll go through some of the examples of the herbal actions and some classic herbs that are used topically. The term of vulnerary basically is a herbal action, kind of like the terms like anti-inflammatory, diuretic, things like that. So vulnerary refers to some sort of herbal agent that speeds up the healing of wounds. It can be used both topically and it can also be used internally as well. So the main conditions would be damage to soft tissues, so cuts and burns and bruises, things like that, or also things like sprains, strains, and fractures. So some of these herbs you can use internally and externally, like calendula is a classic herb for burns and any kind of wound healing. Greater plantain, it's another great herb that can be used both internally and externally for ulcers, for example, also for wound healing. But there are herbs like arnica and comfrey, which should only be used exclusively externally because they have toxic components that could be an issue if you were to ingest them orally. So arnica is on the left. This is the classic remedy for basically trauma to skin, or trauma to the soft tissues like bruises, so blunt injuries mainly. So it helps speed up the healing of like a black eye or a bruise. And comfrey is the classic herb for helping to mend broken bones and fractures. Now, both have also been shown to have benefit for things like arthritis because they possess anti-inflammatory effects, but you should only take them externally. Marigold and chamomile, these are both great herbs that can be consumed both orally or applied topically. They have different phytochemicals in them, great for burns, eczema, ulcers, things like that. The Q studies talk about the wound healing benefits of comfrey. Now, another action that we'll talk about is astringent herbs. So what astringent herbs do is they contain tannins. So these are compounds that you're going to find in like red wine, oaky wines, also in green bananas. So when you bite into a green banana and your mouth sort of puckers up, those are the astringent compounds in the banana. And so if you have an open wound or some kind of cut on your skin, you can use astringent herbs to basically helps to heal it up and kind of these tannins will basically form little complexes with the exposed tissues and kind of draw it together and tighten it up and form like a second barrier, like a second skin on top. And so it's used mainly for really irritated and open wounds, ulcers, also for varicose veins, or someone has eczema and it's like cracked and oozing, then it can be used for that. The classic herbs for this would be things like witch hazel and oak. So you don't want to take a lot of these internally because they can alter your digestion, absorption of nutrients. But topically, they can stop bleeding, can kind of help to heal up ulcers and various wounds. Now, another action called anti-ulcer or anti-ulcerogenic. These herbs are basically used to help speed up the healing of ulcers, and so you can get leg ulcers or foot ulcers externally, and internally you can get stomach ulcers and ulcers in your intestines and things like that. This action is a specific action, but it's usually related to both the vulnerary, which speeds up the healing of wounds, and the astringent effect that can help to create a second layer of skin to allow the ulcer to form. To give you an example, this herb you may not use. It's hard to find in Canada. This is a herb from the Amazon. It's called dragon's blood. It's a nice little resin from a tree that looks nice and red. It's a beautiful, rich, purpley red color. And when you take that resin, you apply it topically, it can help with wound healing. And if you look at, for example, here's like a leg ulcer. This is a patient of mine that had like a venous ulcer. He had venous stasis, and these ulcers would form. There's a circulatory issue with them. And if you look at this slide, and right after applying the dragon's blood, you can see how it basically helped to seal up those little wounds there. And that's because the dragon's blood has both an astringent and a vulnerary property to it. So the astringent effect kind of forms that second layer of skin, and then the vulnerary helps to stimulate the healing process to allow things to heal better. I have a question here. How much details are we expected to know in regards to the studies that you include in your slide? You don't have to know any details. You don't have to know anything about the studies. It's just sort of added. If I add a little PubMed thing, it's just to add a little bit of interest there, but you don't need to know that for the exam. So another action that you can use for topical things is something called escoriatic. Now, an escar is basically a scab in Latin. So an escoriatic herb refers to something that destroys tissue and causes the formation of a scab. And so you got to be careful with escoriatic herbs because it basically is killing the skin. So it's used primarily for things like warts or other skin lesions or skin cancer that you want to basically burn off. So this is like a herbal burning agent, like it basically burns the skin off. There are a couple of herbs that can do this. So if you look at on the left hand side, this is bloodroot, and the reason why they call it bloodroot is because of that nice red color that comes out of there. Different than dragon's blood for sure. One would basically, the bloodroot here, this would cause an ulcer if you kept applying it topically at high doses, while the dragon's blood would help to treat ulcers. The other herb here on the right is mayapple. It's used as an anti-cancer drug. Both of these basically destroy tissues, but they're really useful for warts. Traditionally, they're applied topically also for certain types of skin cancers. I wouldn't use that personally. I'd be more likely to go with conventional routes that way, just because there's not a lot of clinical trials with these. But these things do work for basically burning off warts and various cancers. From my experience, I've used a little formula that had mayapple, bloodroot, and another herb called cedar or thuya, and I've used them for treating warts. And when I worked at Parkdale, I often would get referrals from the nurse practitioner there because they tried to treat the person's warts with liquid nitrogen, salicylic acid, which is a classic sort of wart burning chemical, it's like kind of like aspirin, and other things. And they found that they had a number of patients have really stubborn warts, and then you can see we gave them the herbal formula to take topically for probably about a month or so. But you can see after 1 week how quickly these little lesions started to disappear, and then after about 2 weeks or a month, it was completely gone. So the conventional route wasn't effective, and but the herbal route was. So it's just kind of a neat little story. Someone asked if anti-ulcerogenic herbs are used internally and externally. Yep, they're used for stomach ulcers and for leg ulcers or other ulcers. Now, another topical action is an anodyne. Now, usually an anodyne refers to a painkiller that exerts medicinal effects when applied topically. So it's like a topical analgesic. And so it's used mainly for arthritis, muscle pain, that's what myalgia is, and neuropathies, which is nerve pains. And so essential oils that basically from things like peppermint, wintergreen, camphor, eucalyptus, When they're applied topically to the skin, what they do is, or even internally, they activate various receptors, like hot and cold receptors in your body. So if you apply cayenne, for example, topically to your skin, or clove or ginger, it has that kind of warm, pungent sort of feeling to it. And that's because it's stimulating these hot receptors. Or if you take in like peppermint or eucalyptus or camphor, it stimulates cold receptors. Actually, camphor stimulates both hot and cold receptors. And so what happens is, when you take a sport cream and you apply it topically, it basically stimulates these hot and or cold receptors in your body. And as a result, you feel this kind of cool sensation in the muscles. And so what actually ends up happening is that your brain can't take in both the pain signal and the hot/cold signal. And so it kind of shuts down the pain signal and only allows the cooling, ventilated hot sensation to go to the brain. So it helps to relieve pain. In addition, these essential oils, some of them have anti-inflammatory effects, and some of them also have a vasodilating effect, so they can increase the blood flow to the area. And so it does help with circulation and decrease pain as well, but primarily it basically helps to relieve the symptoms of pain by kind of fooling the brain. Kind of like if you have a mosquito bite and you scratch it, the itch goes away, and that's because you've overridden the itch sensation with the scratch sensation. So I don't use these herbs in herbal form, but wintergreen, it grows in North America, usually in pine forests. This is what makes the same kind of flavor that makes wintergreen gum, the methyl salicylate. That was the toxic essential oil I was telling you about before, that you can absorb it systemically. If you take too much sport cream topically, it can be bad for you. Camphor on the right, that comes from Southeast Asia, and it's that classic sort of muscle cream smell. Eucalyptus and peppermint contain essential oils like eucalyptol and menthol that are used in a lot of these sport creams as well. Now another agent is, or action, is called a rubefacient. Now what rubefacents do is they basically dilate the capillaries in the skin, and that increases blood flow to the area. And so this can be used to basically stimulate blood flow to the area. For example, cayenne, if you apply it topically to the skin, it'll kind of make the skin all red and hot. So cayenne is sometimes used as like a chili plaster or cayenne plaster, and it's basically applied to the skin for back pain, and it helps to decrease pain and increase circulation in the area. A lot of these are related to another action called a counter-irritant. So both essential oils and things from cayenne, because they irritate the skin, it increases circulation in the area and can also alter the perception of pain. So the anodyne, rubefacient, and counter-irritants are all kind of related because they have a similar kind of function or overlapping functions there. These would all be used for things like arthritis, muscle pain, neuropathies, and even things like insect bites. So if you mosquito bites, you could apply a little essential oil to it, sort of numb the bite so it becomes less itchy. Antipruritic, on the topic of reducing itching. Antipruritic, so pruritus means itchy or itching in Latin, so antipruritic means to help to relieve the itch sensation. This is used primarily for like insect bites, or dry skin can get quite itchy, poison ivy, stinging nettles. So an antipruritic herb can work by a couple different mechanisms. For example, oatmeal actually has a compound that maybe helps to moderate the inflammatory reaction. So if someone has like hives, there's like an immune reaction going on, it may help to inhibit that. Oatmeal also has a moisturizing effect. A lot of the essential oils can decrease the itch sensation by overriding it with the hot and cold receptors, by stimulating hot and cold receptors. So that's why things like Tiger Balm or sports creams could be applied, or even just pure essential oil could be applied to an insect bite to help relieve the pain. So different ways that these guys can work. Oatmeal baths are kind of a classic remedy for poison ivy, bad eczema, itchy skin, hives, because it helps to sort of relieve it. One, it has a bit of a moisturizing effect, but two, it contains a compound that helps to decrease the itching. So, topical preparations. We talked about a few different types of herbs you could use topically and how they work. Some topical preparations is, we'll discuss a few ones. I don't use these a lot. The first one I'll talk about is a poultice. So a poultice is basically the Latin term for porridge. So if you had like some kind of skin lesion, let me turn my camera back on for a second. If you had some kind of skin lesion that you wanted to speed up the healing or deal with it, there's a few different ways that you could do that. One would be, let's say, if you had a really bad full body rash, you could take oatmeal, for example, and like grind up the oatmeal and then make like a porridge with it and then just apply it topically to the skin, and that would help sort of decrease the itch. If you had like an open wound, or if you had a sprained tendon or a fracture in your skin or a topical ulcer, you could also apply herbs to the skin. And to give you an example of this is a poultice is basically taking the herb and applying it directly to the skin. So you could take something like, here's comfrey, I gathered it this morning. You could take something like comfrey, steam it quickly just to sort of help to break down the fibers. There's some hairs on here that are a little bit irritating, so if you just steam it like you would with broccoli, or with broccoli, like you would with kale and broccoli and stuff like that, just a little bit, then what happens, it kind of breaks down a bit, and then you could take it, if you had a wound, you could basically apply it and wrap it around the area and apply a few different leaves to it and have it on there. You could wrap some gauze around it as well afterwards and leave it on there for, let's say, an hour or however long, and it could help to sort of with the wound healing or with the whatever the problem is that's going on. So comfrey is specifically designed for fractures. It's also designed for wound healing. So you can do it that way. It's simple and it's cheap to do. It requires some preparation. This is more likely how things would do it like 100 years ago. In practice, I don't really have a lot of comfrey kicking around. I don't really like to get people to make poultices, so I'm more likely to give them a pre-made preparation, but that is one way to do it. When you have the leaves on there, usually when they're steamed and warm, the heat helps to increase circulation to the area. If I've used a poultice, I once had an abscess on my chin that basically was a sebaceous cyst that got infected. And what was really neat is when there's something called a bread poultice. So you literally take a piece of bread, soak it in warm water. Traditionally they use milk, but warm water. Applied it to the abscess. And so the abscess was like a golf ball size, like pimple pretty much. And it was a really bad infection. And when I applied the bread to it, left it on overnight, what basically happens is the bread would sort of, because of the fiber content, I'm assuming, would just sort of start to absorb water around it like a sponge. And I guess maybe the water from the bread and the pus in the abscess kind of would connect and would sort of draw it out like a sponge and kind of suck out the pus. And so basically greatly drained the pus overnight by, I'd say the abscess probably decreased in size by more than 50% just in like an 8-hour period. It's really amazing how well it worked. Bread can be used for that. Other mucilaginous herbs like slippery elm have been used historically for that as well. So there's a place for poultices. We don't use them a lot because it's just not convenient for patients, and they're kind of messy, but they definitely do work. Another approach you can use for topical preparations would be called a fomentation. And so what you do for fomentation is, rather than applying the herbs directly, you take a bunch of cloths and like strips of cloth or gauze, and you dip it in a herbal solution. So that could be like you make a cup of tea from the herbs, or you take maybe some water and you add a couple teaspoons or a tablespoon of tincture to it. You basically drip the cloth in the tincture. So if this is for my tea, so I just literally drop it in, take it out, and then you just sort of wrap it over top of the skin lesion. And you do that a few times and just let it sit there for, could be a couple hours or minutes. And you're basically getting the herbal preparation saturates the cloth or the gauze, and then it sits there for a period of time. And so that would be more like if you had a wound that you didn't want to apply a cream or something else directly to it. This would be a way that you could sort of apply it and then remove the bandage without risk of it sort of clogging it up and sticking to it. Sometimes applying whole herbs or other preparations could just be too messy to do it that way. So the difference between the poultice is the poultice use the entire herb, while the fomentation you use a herbal extract and apply it to cloth and then wrap the affected area in it. Now, a couple other things that you can do is you can make ointments, salves, or unguents. Basically what these are is a salve is more or less it's like a fat-based extract. So what you're doing is you're taking your medicated oil, like the calendula oil that you made before, by taking olive oil and infusing it with calendula flowers, and you could add some essential oils to it if you wanted to, and then you add wax to it as a thickening agent. So if you look at down at the bottom there's my hand. I just took a photo last night of this so you can see what it looks like. It kind of has kind of a thick, waxy like consistency to it. So with this, there's no water in these things. So these are fat-based ones, non-polar extracts, non-polar extracts. They don't contain any water. So if you look, mostly oil, a little bit of wax, and you could add essential oils to it as well. And so these are, pretty good preparations. Helps create a protective barrier. You might use it topically for burns or scrapes and strains and things like that. Not really great from a cosmetic standpoint because these guys can be kind of greasy. So if you wanted a moisturizer, this wouldn't be ideal for it because your face would look all kind of waxy and greasy. But it's a good way to apply those fat-soluble compounds to the skin. So burns, eczema, things like that works pretty well. Now, to contrast to a lotion or cream, lotions and creams have about equal parts of oil to water. So you're kind of making like almost like a mayonnaise-like consistency to it. And if you look at it here, it's just a nice light thing that is very well absorbing the skin. You can add a little bit of wax. It could be beeswax or lanolin. Lanolin is basically like the wax that comes from sheep's wool, the cover of it. And you can add to thicken it up. You can add some essential oils to this. But the difference with this one is you do have the water and you do have the fat of the oil in it as well. And so it tends to be better absorbed by the skin. It's a better moisturizer. You can get some systemic absorption with this. It's a little less protective, but it doesn't have that greasiness that you get from the salves. Now, another thing are the liniments. A liniment is basically an oily liquid mixture that's very, very high in essential oils, and it's designed to be applied topically to the skin to help with muscle pain and back pain and arthritis and things like that. So the classic thing in Chinese medicine, I've used this before, is woodlock oil. And basically, it's made up of turpentine with a whole bunch of essential oils. Again, lavender, menthol, camphor, wintergreen. And then you kind of apply it with friction to the skin to get it into the muscles and to help to relieve the pain. Tiger Balm, Rub 8535, or those other types of sports creams, they all have the same types of things in it. Some will have a little bit of cinnamon, some might have a little bit more camphor in it, some will have wintergreen in it, but they're essentially the same. They have a pretty strong odor to it, and they're designed to act as a counter irritant, increase blood flow to the area, and decrease pain. The main disadvantage with it, they tend to have a pretty strong odor to it, so if you go and apply this to your skin and then go to work or go to school, you're going to be a little bit stinky with it, but not everyone likes the smell. And also, as I mentioned last time, you will get some systemic absorption with it, and there have been reports of people overdosing by applying too much of these to their skin. So, some other things you can do are different types of baths. So, if you have a bath at home, you could take, for example, oatmeal, and you could put it into a stocking of some sort or a cheesecloth and soak it in the bath. And then basically the active ingredient, all the mucilage and some of the other compounds in there would just become dissolved in the water and just coat your skin. And that would be a way to, if you had like a full body eczema or some kind of rash, you could help deal with that. Or you could do it more like localized. You could get like a bucket and put cayenne powder into it and put your feet in there. And this is a classic sort of remedy for if your someone's coming down with a cold, is they might drink hot teas with cayenne and then put their feet in cayenne water, and that can help stimulate circulation in the body and helps stimulate the immune system. Another thing you might do is a sitz bath, and this is sort of specific for issues with like the rectal area. So if you had hemorrhoids or anal fissures, you might take get a sitz bath out and add in certain herbs like witch hazel, which is astringent. It can help heal up the wounds and tighten up the skin a little bit to help treat a hemorrhoid. So they're pretty inexpensive. You've got good compliance. Requires some cleanup. That's a bit of a disadvantage to it. You might have lots of the dry herb available to do it. Certainly, I've used sitz baths with patients after they've had a delivery or with hemorrhoids or anal fissures. It's great. Doing oatmeal baths, it can be a little messy sometimes, and it requires a little extra preparation or a little bit extra cleanup afterwards, which is not the end of the world, but it can be an issue for some people. A few other things, gargling. So you can make teas or add a little bit of a herbal tincture to water and just gargle with it. It's going to be specific for someone having a sore throat or tonsillitis that you want to sort of bathe the area with the herbs. Ear oils, I often use, for example, a clove of garlic with a tablespoon of olive oil, and then apply a few little drops in the ear for ear infections. It works pretty well. Just got to make sure there aren't any open wounds in the ear if you do that. And then internal preparations, last few things here. You can do lozenges, and so basically what lozenges are, these are like cough drops. Lots of different companies make these, and they tend to use some kind of sugar or honey or some kind of mucilage, and then they dissolve essential oils in that or other herbal extracts, and it has kind of a local effect, so it's quite useful for sore throats or coughs. You get good patient compliance with it. If you do too much of it, it can be irritating to the GI tract, and it's really only effective for certain types of herbs and stuff, but that's what a lozenge is. Capsules and tablets, probably one of the easiest ways you can get patients to take their herbs. So you basically either have the herbal materials just ground up and then put into a capsule, or you've got some kind of like solid extract that's then encapsulated or out of the tablets. The main benefit is you get great compliance from the patient because they can just take a few tablets a day or whatever they need to take. Minimal taste to them. They're cost effective, generally speaking, good compliance. Disadvantage, I think sometimes being able to taste the herbs has some beneficial effects. Also, some people don't like taking tablets and capsules. They kind of have like, they're already taking 50 pills a day and they're just overwhelmed with the pills, so they prefer to take a tincture or a tea. So that's something to consider. With regards to absorption, I would say that there's no evidence that says that tablets are not as well absorbed as capsules. I know some companies have done a study showing that the tablets they use are just as well absorbed as the liquid extracts or the tinctures that they also sell. So it depends more based on the excipients, the binders, and the fillers that are in there. But generally speaking, I think capsules are preferable maybe just because they feel better going down, but I don't think that it's fair to say that they're not as well absorbed, that tablets are not as well absorbed as capsules. And then finally, the last couple preparations, suppositories. You can have rectal or vaginal suppositories. I've used these before, primarily for vaginosis or vaginal yeast infections. I might use a boric acid suppository. I might use a golden seal or a probiotic suppository. Also for hemorrhoids and proctitis, so inflammation of the rectum, I've used herbal extracts using tannins. You basically can get compounding pharmacists to make these, or you can make them yourself using things like coconut oil, mixing herbs in with it, and just inserting them into the cavity. It's good because you get a localized effect. A little bit tricky to find people who will make them. Compounding pharmacists will. I've made them just myself. You can buy kits to make them. You can also just take, for example, tin foil, wrap it around a pen, and then just pour the herbal mixture into that and then put it in the fridge. It just doesn't look very professional for your patients, but you could do it for yourself that way. And then finally, enemas, not the most popular things for people to do. You're basically injecting a liquid into usually the rectum. Vaginal douche is like the same sort of thing, although I'd never recommend those because there's concern that you could cause increases of risk for pelvic inflammatory disease, so you can push the bacteria in the places where you don't want to. But basically with enemas, you can get one of these tubes, or you can get this water bottle contraption, insert it into the rectum, and then you turn the tap or you squeeze it in, and you can get astringent or vulnerary herbs into the rectum and into the colon. That can help with some kind of inflammation of those body parts, or if someone had chronic constipation, you can do coffee enemas. So I haven't really recommended a lot of these to patients. Culturally, people don't like doing enemas as much. So there's